Zimbabwe plans to cut value-added tax from January to stimulate consumer demand in an economy set to a contract this year after a drought and power shortages. The southern African nation is in the grips of its worst economic crisis in a decade, marked by shortages of foreign currency, fuel, and rolling power cuts lasting up to 18 hours a day. Presenting the 2020 budget to Parliament, the Finance Minister Mithuli Ncube proposed cutting VAT to 14.5% from 15% effective January 2020. He also proposed lowering the corporate income tax rate to 24% from 25%. President Emerson Mnangagwa, who took over from the late Robert Mugabe in 2017, is struggling to convince the population that his economic reforms will work. And Africa needs to attract investment by building on solid foundations of transparency, accountability, and quality projects, among others. The president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, while speaking to Channels Television after the African Investment Forum in South Africa, says Africa is competing with the rest of the world for foreign direct investment.
When you look at investment, you have to actually attract investment to Africa by building on solid foundations. The foundations are transparency, accountability, quality projects, being able to have instruments that will reduce the risk for the investors that want to come into Africa. Remember, Africa is competing with the rest of the world when it comes to foreign direct investment. So we are putting all the elements in place. This is the first time that Africa actually has a platform like this for the world to land on for transactions, for investments. This is going to continue. This is the biggest thing that we've done for Africa.
Have you heard any concerns from these investors that are consistent concerns?
Well, yeah, sure. We know the issues that the investors want. First and foremost, they want to be sure that, they are investing in the right place. And so my job and task is, and the others, is to convince them that it is actually investing in the right place. You take, for example, even Moody's investors report shows very clearly that in terms of bank finance debt, all across the world, from 2003 to 2018 rather, Africa has one of the least in terms of default rates. But you have capital going into the areas that have the highest default rates, which are Latin America, Asia, Oceania, and North America. But Africa, that has the least, one of the least, is not attracting capital. So that means that a lot of it is not so much real risk as much as perception risk. Something happens in one African country, Africa has a problem, and somebody comes on a trip and say, oh, I'm just coming from Africa. Well, look, Africa is not a country. And so these are some of the things that we are trying to do, inform people about investment opportunities in Africa. We're having a lot of democratic governments. We're having more governments that get more accountable. Transparency is getting more entrenched. And I think that these are the things that investors basically are asking for. And quite honestly, it's not too much to ask for anyone that wants to do decent business.
We have so many of the things going across borders, that infrastructure that will help improve or support the Africa free trade, continental free trade area. Now, looking at the bad places, the bad spots, places like Mali, for example, South Sudan and all that, how much is there a dialogue going on to ensure that they don't pull back progress that is being made with all these other countries?
African Development Bank is not moonlighting in Africa. This is my neighborhood. This is our neighborhood. We know this neighborhood better than anybody else. But we also have a responsibility that no one and no country is left behind. As a bank, our responsibility is to make sure that we provide opportunities for all, that we understand the peculiarities of those countries and recognize their challenges, but then have instruments that allows us to make investment in those areas. Let me break it down for you. You take, for example, places like Sudan that you just mentioned. Sudan just has a new government. But in fact, private sector investment in Sudan works perfectly well. Perfect.
South Sudan?
Yeah. South Sudan, even South Sudan, it works perfectly well. Now, the African Development Bank, you mentioned Mali, for example. Well, the African Development Bank is not afraid of investing in any African country. We have a facility that's called Private Sector Enhancement Facility, which allows the bank, it's $500 million facility. It allows the bank to cover its risk of investing in low-income or fragile states. because we know we've got to do it. So we ensure our investments there. Now, what has happened is today, 75% of all of our investments in private sector is actually done in the low-income countries and the fragile states that you're talking about. And our non-performing loans, it's actually about 1%. And so it means it's not as bad. You got to understand your neighborhood to being able to do that. If you take, for example, the case that you were saying with regard to Mali, we invest massively in agriculture in Mali. We invested in irrigation in Mali. We invested in a new solar system for Mali called the Segu Power, which is supposed to provide them access to power. Take, for example, the entire Sahelian countries. The biggest challenge they have is they don't have access to electricity, right? And yet they have a lot of sunlight. And so what the bank is doing now is that we've just launched an initiative called the Desert to Power, which is to allow, we're going to finance the construction and the development of 10,000 megawatts of solar power systems across the 11 Sahelian countries. And by the way, that also cuts through northern part of Nigeria, right? And so what will that do? That will allow us to have 250 million people have access to electricity, right? And 90 million of those will be via decentralized off-grid systems for energy. So that will make it the largest solar zone in the world. And so all I'm trying to say is that there are lots of opportunities in so-called fragile states that people talk about, but it requires that you have the right instrument, you have faith and confidence in them, and that you stay with them to build institutions.
Finally, your tenure is about to end, and hopefully it's going to continue. The first tenure, yes. The first tenure. And I know you have the nod from your president to go on. Okay. What have been the high points for you this first 5 years, yes? What have been the high points for you achievement-wise, and what will you be focusing on for the next tenure?
I'm grateful to His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari for supporting me so strongly in this particular role. I'm grateful to Nigeria for his strong support, Minister Ahmed in Nigeria, for during the general capital increase of the bank, which we just heard. And that general capital increase of the bank just increased the quantum of resources that we have by a whopping $115 billion, moving our capital from $93 billion to $208 billion.
And finally, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has warned that companies mining and buying copper and cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo must do more to fight corruption and child labor in the country. Congo is the world's largest cobalt producer and fifth largest producer of copper. And with that, we draw the curtain on today's edition of the program and, of course, for the week. Thank you for being part of it. I'm Chimezie Obi. You're welcome.